Hello, everyone. I want to welcome everyone to today's webinar, Rising to the Occasion, ADA, Olmstead, and State Efforts to Promote Integrated Employment of Individuals with Significant Disabilities. My name is Chris Button. I am here with Serena Lowe and some other ODEP staff and our lead staff to welcome you to this really exciting and timely webinar on this very current and important topic. As we were preparing for the webinar today, it caused me to think back to the Olmstead decision, the report that the Department of Labor actually issued back in 2001 about increasing integrated employment opportunities for individuals with significant disabilities in community-based jobs at real wages. And I pulled that report and looked at the very beginning of it, at the executive summary, and it started with a definition of freedom that I wanted to share with you just to kick this off today, because to me it so reflects what we are talking about, just reflects what it's all about. And it's from the American Heritage College Dictionary, and it says in part, freedom, possession of civil rights, the capacity to exercise choice, free will, the right to unrestricted use, full access, the right of enjoying all of the privileges of membership or citizenship. Today we have the unique and exciting opportunity to hear about and to celebrate all the progress that has been made in this area and about the current really exciting happenings that are opening the door to full participation and freedom for youth and adults with significant disabilities. I want to thank in advance all of our speakers. We have some incredible folks that you're going to be hearing from today. I also want to thank ODEP's lead staff on this area, Serena Lowe, for her leadership on behalf of ODEP and the Department of Labor in making sure that youth and adults with disabilities have the choice to be able to be out in the community, exercising their freedom like everyone else. Serena, I'm going to just turn it over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Chris, for those great comments and for really helping frame today's important webinar. We really wanted to highlight some of the exciting developments that have been brought to bear over the last couple of years in particular as we attempt to continue to implement the vision of the ADA and the spirit of the Olmstead integration mandate with fidelity. And as part of ODEP's investment in state employment first initiatives, we feel so strongly that our panels that we have today really reflect that spirit in its whole. We're going to be highlighting today a great example of federal-state partnerships in terms of helping a state improve its compliance with the Olmstead integration mandate as it relates to employment. And while employment is our focus today, certainly it's just a part of the Olmstead integration mandate. But we believe it's central because we know after 14 years since our inception as a federal agency that investing in the supports that individuals need to be successful in the market in integrated employment is a key step in the direction of them optimizing their self-sufficiency and really engaging fully in the communities that they live. So we're just delighted to have such a wealth of interest. We had over 600 individuals across the country register for today's webinar. We're going to do a couple of housekeeping items, and so I'm going to turn it over to our webinar administrator from the National Lead Center, Nakia Matthews, and she will walk you through those, and then I will introduce our facilitator for today's event. So Nakia, turning it over to you.
Thank you, Serena. The audio for today's webinar is being broadcast through your computer. Please make sure your speakers are turned on or your headphones are plugged in. You can control the audio broadcast via the audio broadcast panel, which you see below, And if you accidentally close this panel or if the sound stops, you can reopen it by going to Communicate, Join Audio Broadcast. If you do not have sound capabilities on your computer or you prefer to listen by phone, you can dial the number you see here and enter the meeting code, and you do not need to enter an attendee ID. And I will also paste this number into the chat box. Sorry about that, guys. Please note in the lower right-hand side of your screen, we do have closed captioning available in the Media Viewer panel. If you'd like to make the Media Viewer panel larger, you can do so by minimizing some of the other panels like Chat, Q&A, or Participants. And conversely, if you do not need the captions, you can minimize the Media Viewer panel. If you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box to send me, Nakia Matthews, a message, or you may email me directly at nmatthews@ndi-inc.org. There will be a question and answer portion at the end of the webinar. Please use the chat box or the Q&A box to submit questions during the webinar, and we will direct them accordingly. If you are listening by phone and not logged into the web portion, you may also ask questions by emailing them directly to Ari at ANEEMAN@autisticadvocacy.org. And I'm going to turn it back over to Serena.
Thanks so much, Nakia. It's my enormous pleasure to introduce our facilitator for today's webinar, and it was only appropriate, given the theme today, to ask who, in my view, is one of the nation's foremost leaders in the self-advocacy movement, Ari Naiman, to be our master of ceremony, so to speak. Ari does not need much of an introduction to many of you, but I'm going to try to do him justice anyway. Ari is the President and Executive Director of the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network and has been for several years. In my view, they are one of the leading self-advocacy organizations in the country that is really run for and by people with significant disabilities. Ari is also serves on the National Council on Disability, where he's currently the vice chair, and he is co-chair of our National Lead Center's policy team, which we really are very privileged to work with him. Ari has been a dear colleague and peer to all of us. We continue to learn from him, and he really has pushed issues related to the employment of people with the most significant disabilities to the forefront of our national public policy dialogue in recent years. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to Ari, and just thank you again, Ari, for your time today and for taking on the moderation responsibilities for today.
Well, thank you for that quite flattering introduction. Before I begin, one small correction. I am not, in fact, the Vice Chair of the National Council on Disability. That role belongs to my council colleagues, Stephanie Orlando and Camilla Proctor-Jones, but I have the honor of working with them, and I appreciate this invitation to speak among what is truly an extraordinary panel of national experts on the issue of integrated employment for people with disabilities. This month marks the 24th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. We are now almost a quarter century after the nation's landmark civil rights law for people with disabilities, and 15 years after the Supreme Court's landmark ruling in Olmstead v. LC. Yet, despite that, and despite all of the progress that has been made in bringing our country's disability rights victories into maturity, much work needs to be done. Of course, the work of community integration did not begin with the ADA and Olmstead. Between 1960 and the present, almost 200 institutions for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities were closed and their residents supported into integrated community settings, and a corresponding effort around community integration for people with psychiatric, physical, sensory, and other disabilities has also been a major priority of federal disability rights advocacy and disability rights advocacy throughout civil society. And yet, because of the progress that we have made, we now have a unique opportunity to take the ADA and to take, in particular, the Olmstead decision and apply it beyond just the institutionalization. We can now apply it to community integration throughout every aspect of life. And that's what this webinar is going to be about today. Now, many of you are already very familiar with the critical leadership role that the Department of Justice has played over the course of the last several years in advancing state compliance with the Olmstead decision and in realizing the full potential of the Olmstead decision as a precedent that applies not only to residential services, but also to day and employment services. There are few people who have played a more integral role in that process than our first speaker, Eve Hill, Deputy Assistant Attorney General for the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. Prior to her work at DOJ, Eve was a leading, and still is, a leading disability rights attorney and served as the Senior Vice President of the Burden Blatt Institute at Syracuse University. In 2011, Ms. Hill joined the law firm of Brown, Goldstein, and Levy. At the Burden Blatt Institute, she was responsible for the Institute's work on the Americans with Disabilities Act, Disability Civil Rights, and Communications. In the same year, she was appointed to the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice, and she is responsible for the division's disability-related work. Eve, thank you for your leadership, and with that, I'd like to hand this over to you.
Thank you. Thanks for that very kind introduction. I hope you can hear me. I wish I could take credit for all that the Justice Department has done in this area, but it's really a great team here. And I know that you all have met a number of them, and they're a fantastic group. I was asked to talk about the history of Olmstead implementation, how the Olmstead principles apply to employment, and how the Justice Department is applying those principles to employment and day services. So starting a little bit with where we began, people with disabilities were often in the past, and still today, hidden away in regimented institutions far from their family and friends, and often living in just deplorable conditions. Congress enacted the Civil Rights of Institutionalized Persons Act in 1980 to give the Department of Justice the ability to enforce the constitutional and federal statutory rights of people in institutions, and we took that authority very seriously. We've investigated the conditions in scores of institutions over the years. But only with the enactment of the ADA and the subsequent Olmstead versus LC decision about the ADA's integration mandate were we able to examine not just how people with disabilities were treated when they were in institutions, but also whether they needed to be there in the first place. And for that reason, the Olmstead case has rightly been called the Brown versus Board of Education of the Disability Rights, in that it doesn't look just at whether the segregated settings are equal or good. It looks at whether there should be segregating settings at all. Like Brown, thanks to Olmstead, we now know, and we have known, that it's not just the conditions of an institution that make them discriminatory, it's the fact of unnecessary segregation. Because as the Supreme Court noted in Olmstead, that institutional placement of people who can handle and benefit from community settings perpetuates unwarranted assumptions that those people are incapable or unworthy of participating in community life. And that, in fact, confinement in an institution severely diminishes the everyday life activities of those people with disabilities. We believe the ability to be part of your community is a right from which all other rights flow. It does not matter if the restaurant is accessible, or if there's an accessible voting machine, or if the bus has accessibility features. if you can't get out of the institution in order to enjoy those things. And so our work in that area demonstrates that belief. So Olmstead held that states are prohibited from discriminating in their services, programs, and activities, and that integration requires the administration of those services, programs, and activities in the most integrated setting appropriate for the person. Not appropriate for the provider, but the one appropriate for the person with a disability. The most integrated setting is one that enables people with disabilities to interact with people without disabilities to the furthest extent possible. And the Supreme Court went on to say that public entities are required to provide services in the community when those services are appropriate, when the people who are going to get them do not oppose community-based treatment, and when community-based treatment can be reasonably accommodated, taking into account the resources available to the entity and the needs of others receiving those services. At the Civil Rights Division, we've used Olmstead to help us knock down the walls separating people with disabilities from people without. Since 2009, we've participated in about 44 matters in about 24 states. And just in the last fiscal year, we continued that work, participating in 18 Olmstead matters across the country. We've reached settlement agreements under this administration with 8 states, Georgia, Delaware, North Carolina, Virginia, New York, Texas, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire. And we've addressed people with all kinds of disabilities, of all ages, in all kinds of institutions. To start, we looked at state-run institutions, which at the time of the turn of the mid-20th century held hundreds of thousands of people with disabilities, and our first settlement was about state-run institutions in Georgia. Today, many states no longer operate those institutions themselves, and while that's certainly progress, many states have moved away from those state-run institutions to serving people in private institutions that are funded by the state. And for a person with a disability stuck in an institution, the name on the facility is not the point. So whether in public or private institutions, people with disabilities are harmed by being surrounded and segregated, surrounded only by people with other disabilities and segregated from their communities, their families, and their friends. So Olmstead doesn't just apply when the government owns or operates a facility. It also applies when the state is financing the segregation of people with disabilities in private placements, or when it's promoting segregation through the planning, service, design, and funding choices and practices that it implements. So some of our more recent enforcement efforts have focused on challenging unnecessary segregation in privately run, state-funded institutions. And we did that in North Carolina, for example, where the state was funding people with mental illness in segregated adult care homes. But the point of Olmstead is also not just the institutions. The point of Olmstead is that people with disabilities have a right to get services in the most integrated setting that's appropriate for them. Therefore, our cases have focused less on the institution and more on making sure that high-quality services are available in people's communities so they don't ever have to go into an institution unnecessarily. And we've done work in a variety of settings requiring a variety of different kinds of services, everything from expanded Medicaid waivers, transition and discharge services, case management, family support, crisis hotlines, respite services, assertive community treatment teams, supported housing, short-term stabilization apartments, peer support, mobile crisis teams, supported employment, and integrated day services, and more and more and more. And the key to that is that the services have to be provided. We require quality assurance measures for those services and outcome measures to make sure that the agreements that we reach have the intended result, which is that people with disabilities can live full lives in their communities. Some of our most recent experiences in the Olmstead effort has been focused on the recognition that even people with disabilities who live in the community frequently experience segregation during the day, either at work, at school, or in recreational activities. And so we know it's not enough to live in the community if you spend all your days in a segregated setting. And nothing in the ADA or the integration mandate is limited to residential settings. So we're challenging unnecessary segregation of people with disabilities in sheltered workshops and other day services. Which brings me to Rhode Island. In Rhode Island, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities were being denied those opportunities. Before this past year, the vast majority of people with IDD were consigned to sheltered workshops where they rarely had contact with non-disabled people, where they performed rote, menial, manual tasks, and where they were paid far below the minimum wage. These workers were not in the most integrated setting appropriate for them. Rather, it was pretty clear that they were capable of working in integrated jobs and participating in their communities. So one of those people that I met is Stephen. For 30 years, Stephen did what we all do. He got up every day and he reported to work. But for most of his life, he had no choice other than to work in a sheltered workshop where he earned $2 an hour. Stephen didn't expect to spend 30 years working there. Even the name of the program, Training Through Placement, indicated that it was leading to a real job. But the lack of community-based employment services and supports kept him there in a segregated, sub-minimum wage environment for 30 years. So this April, the department entered a settlement agreement with the state of Rhode Island in which the state committed to provide supported employment services to about 2,000 people with disabilities in segregated settings. These individuals will receive enough support to maintain a 40-hour week balanced between day and work activities. The expectation is that people will work in a supported employment job at competitive wages for an average across the population of at least 20 hours a week. The settlement also requires the state to provide integrated day services when those people are not working. So as a result of the settlement, Rhode Islanders with IDD will have opportunities to work at real jobs at competitive wages, and the state funding that has been used for segregated, separate day programs and workshops will be redirected to provide integrated options for both work and non-work hours. But Olmstead's also not limited to people who are already in institutions. It also protects people who are at significant risk of being placed in an institution. So our Rhode Island settlement also deals with young people who were at risk of ending up in sheltered workshops or segregated day programs because they were not being provided a pathway from school into integrated work. Employment, training, and service providers were not working with the schools to provide those young people with disabilities the skills they would need and the experiences they would need to obtain a good-paying job with supported services and in integrated setting. One student like this, Pedro, spent his teenage years unpacking and sorting buttons in a school-based sheltered workshop. And therefore, without adequate training to do anything else, when he graduated, he had to take a sheltered workshop job that paid just 48 cents an hour. So the Rhode Island settlement now requires the state to work with over 1,000 transition-age youth to help them prepare for integrated employment after they leave school. Students with disabilities will get transition services starting at age 14, so when they leave school, they can get real jobs at competitive wages. And the settlement is already improving the lives of Rhode Islanders. Stephen, who I mentioned earlier, is now transitioned from his $2 an hour sheltered workshop job to an integrated office setting where he makes minimum wage and has started to receive computer training. Pedro is working in a restaurant where he was recently named Employee of the Month, and his progress has been so rapid that he no longer needs a job coach. Instead, he teaches his former job coach how to help people with disabilities better. So what does the department look for in a state employment system that is trying to reduce its over-reliance on segregated employment and day services? We think Rhode Island is a model. It calls for real, measurable outcomes, not just words on paper or highfalutin policies. As we've all seen, well-meaning directives to underfunded and overburdened and overworked state agencies without outcomes, quality measures, and sustained funding doesn't result in effective systems change. So the Rhode Island model calls for individualized, typical jobs in the community and goals for the target population, how many people will be served, requires them to be earning at least minimum wage, requires them to be working among peers without disabilities for the maximum hour consistent with a person's abilities and preferences, and calls for an average across the population of 20 hours of employment per week. People can choose a segregated setting, but only through a variance process where they first try integrated employment and supported services. You can't decide that you cannot work or that you cannot be in an integrated employment until you try integrated employment. The agreement also addresses youth and the path to sheltered workshops. So it requires the Rhode Island Department of Education to adopt an employment first policy, something it has never had before, that would make work in the integrated setting a priority service for youth. And then youth in transition will get integrated vocational and situational assessments. So vocational and situational assessments that are not conducted at a sheltered workshop. They will get trial work experience, and they'll get a number of other services that they need to create their capacity to work in the community after school. This settlement wraps around integrated day services around employment. So if you're not going to be able to work 40 hours a week, you're going to get integrated services in the rest of the week that add up to 40 hours. And integrated day services are defined as allowing people with IDD to engage in self-directed activities in the community, mainstream community-based recreational, social, educational, cultural, and athletic activities. Finally, or not finally, but next it requires a sustained commitment to funding. This is a 10-year settlement, and over that 10 years, the state is to redirect, redistribute, and reallocate the funds it currently uses to support segregated services and use that money to support integrated services. It requires education, outreach, and informed choice. So the state has to be reaching out to people with disabilities and their families to explain the benefits of supported employment and address their concerns about participating in supported employment. And to ensure informed choice, people with IDD can participate in segregated settings only if they really are informed. They really undergo an assessment, a trial work experience, get outreach information, and benefits counseling. It also deals with the question of provider capacity, requiring the state to establish a sheltered workshop conversion institute to help current providers of sheltered workshops and new providers of supported employment to convert and build their capacity to do supported employment services. It requires the state to establish a sheltered workshop conversion trust of $800,000 to help with startup costs as providers convert from a sheltered workshop system to supported employment services, and requires the state to contract with technical assistance providers to provide leadership training and technical assistance to employment and day services providers and state staff. It also requires the state to ensure a reimbursement model that will help address some of the barriers that we hear about often, such as transportation, employer negotiation, and counseling clients by phone. And finally, it requires interagency collaboration. None of the agencies involved could do this alone. So there will be interagency agreements among the Department of Behavioral Health Care, Developmental Disabilities and Hospitals, the Office of Rehabilitation Services, and the Rhode Island Department of Education. There's one little piece of that wasn't entered into the Memorandum of Agreement. But state and federal government players and people with disabilities can't do this alone. Business is a key player. So a few weeks ago, Rhode Island, along with the U.S. Business Leadership Network and Walgreens, hosted a summit bringing together employers and disability services agencies to improve competitive integrated employment for people with disabilities. And the businesses at that summit made clear that they are ready to play their part. For businesses, the commitment demonstrated by an agreement like that in Rhode Island provides them the certainty they need, that the services they need to support individuals with IDD in competitive integrated jobs won't disappear when the next administration or the next legislature comes in, that the array of job developers, job coaches, and other professionals to provide support won't shrivel up, and that the infrastructure of partnership with state agencies won't all be for nothing. We learned there that, for example, Procter & Gamble had one facility with a turnover rate that was very high, nearly 100%, which seems impossible. and that declined to less than 25% turnover when the facility decided to hire a significant number of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We heard from Walgreens that some of the company's most productive facilities were those that hire a significant number of people with disabilities. And we heard about a change in morale at stores like CVS. In fact, we heard so much about the positive impact of inclusion on morale from all kinds of businesses, from a small automotive shop to a large retailer like TJ Maxx. Everybody had positive outcomes that came from their hiring people with disabilities. So businesses want to hire. Section 503 has encouraged businesses further to want to hire. But despite all this, despite the ADA, despite hundreds of thousands of people with disabilities moving into the job market, even still hundreds of thousands of people with disabilities remain in institutional settings, including over 400,000 in segregated sheltered workshops or segregated day programs. Ending that unnecessary and unwarranted segregation of people with disabilities is a priority of the Civil Rights Division, just as is ensuring that people with disabilities receive services in the most integrated setting appropriate for them. And the transformation of the U.S. from a country where just a few decades ago the idea of integration of people with disabilities wasn't really even thought about to today where integration is taken more seriously could not have happened without the work of all of us, the work of the federal government, state government agencies, service providers, people with disabilities, advocates, and everyone listening on this phone. And it is working. People are telling us the stories of how their lives have changed since leaving institutions or because they never had to go to an institution. And you can read some of those on our Faces of Olmstead page, which is ada.gov/Olmstead, and then there's a Faces click. And then we'll have a video up there shortly that we put together to celebrate the 15th anniversary of the Olmstead decision, and we'll post that soon. And these are stories of the future. These are the stories that exemplify how ending unnecessary segregation improves the lives of people with and without disabilities. And they reveal the transformative power of the ADA and the Olmstead decision. But they also teach us how much work there is still to do. The call for fully integrated communities has not been completely answered. So we're just going to have to continue to work together, using all our tools, probably developing new ones, in order to make integration real for real people. And I'm honored, the Civil Rights Division is honored, to be able to stand with all of you here today to continue to build on that promise. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eve, for a stirring set of remarks and an excellent overview of both existing progress and our vision for the future. As Eve mentioned, there are a lot of exciting things going on in Rhode Island right now, so without further ado, I would like to introduce Michelle Brophy, Director of Policy Implementation for the Department of Behavioral Health Care, Developmental Disabilities, and Hospitals for the state of Rhode Island, and Andrew McQuaid, a Consent Decree and Settlement Agreement Coordinator, also for the state of Rhode Island, to talk about some of what's going on in Rhode Island and the state's transition towards a system of integrated employment services for people with developmental disabilities. Michelle, Andrew, take it away.
Thank you. Good afternoon. The state of Rhode Island really greatly appreciates the opportunity to join you all today. As usual, we are grateful to our colleague Eve Hill at the Department of Justice, though Michelle and I joked that we were exhausted just hearing about all of the work that we're going to be doing over the next 10 years. While preparing for today's webinar, Michelle and I almost inadvertently prepared two sets of notes. We quickly realized that both were almost identical in substance, and yet while one celebrated this critical work, shined a light on exciting outcomes, ongoing efforts, and future possibilities in Rhode Island, the other set of notes managed to be almost overly sobering, focused on the very real challenges of comprehensive systems change, the at times high transaction costs associated with meaningful collaboration, and acknowledged just how much we both individually and as a state still have to learn?
So instead of selecting one set of the notes over the other, we weaved them together and created what we're calling the pragmatic Pollyanna approach. We plan to discuss two specific areas: interagency counsel, interagency collaboration, and culture change. Both have presented the state incredible opportunities and daily challenges. Interagency collaboration is a fundamental force in Rhode Island's transformation. It has allowed us to tear down the silos between agencies, increasing communication and each other's understanding of our systems and how those systems interact, and may more effectively interact to create greater seamlessness between our schools, vocational rehabilitation, and long-term supports. It has also brought non-signatories to the table.
As a legal document, it probably doesn't come as a surprise to anyone that, shockingly, not every state agency in Rhode Island was clamoring to get their name on the signature page of the consent decree. However, with that said, the work of the consent decree has engaged other agencies.
So the agencies that we're now engaging also include the Department of Labor and Training, Medicaid, the Department of Health, the Department of Children, Youth, and Families, and the Department of Transportation. We are acknowledging that our interdependence, that we are stronger together, and that we know that we will, without question, fail if we tried alone.
This interdependence expands outward, and Rhode Island has learned so much from states across the country, and we do appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today. In many ways, Michelle and I continue to do this because this is a great opportunity for us to say, come help us. We have a lot of work to do, and we continuously learn from your successes, your ongoing efforts. They are absolutely invaluable to us. Specifically, the State Employment Leadership Network and ODEP's Vision Quest has been an incredible resource that we encourage other states to utilize in their ability to bring our larger community together. And we also really want to acknowledge and appreciate the state's continuing conversations with the state of Ohio and its county boards. Those conversations have created a fantastic partnership, and we encourage other states to find a state or find multiple states to keep this conversation going. However, we've also had to navigate different definitions of collaboration. Collaboration has increasingly become a buzzword within public administration, and as a result, collaboration can mean countless meetings without any real outcomes.
Likewise, those real outcomes we are striving for as a result of collaboration are hard. Figuring out how to meaningfully braid and blend funds is necessary but challenging, and at a time when our fiscal reality actually increases the need for collaboration, resistance towards collaboration instead grows.
We continually need to reconcile the lag that collaboration creates in the short run with the sustainability it creates in the long run. It is more efficient in the short run to make a unilateral decision, but collaboration creates greater buy-in and participation in decision-making, continues to make those outcomes of our decisions stronger, particularly as it pertains to making operational the consent decree that Eve just spoke of. In some ways, it would be more efficient for us to have a top-down model in order to create policies and practices that would make the consent decree operational. But we acknowledge that without the participation of our stakeholders, including our Employment First Task Force and our community around us, that those decisions, those policies will not be as sustainable in the long run.
So while we have witnessed changes in our interagency collaboration, immersed in all aspects of our work is a larger cultural change.
It is ever present. It brings clarity to, as we say, what is positively possible. And again, the sobering reality is that the culture change at times can cloud change with myths and misconceptions.
Some of the most exciting developments in our cultural change is the creativity, which is coming from just about everywhere. Providers, parents, businesses are all rethinking business as usual, or finally finding a culture that is ready to embrace something that we have been striving to do for decades. Conversations rapidly result in action, and the culture change means leaders can come from anywhere at any time, and leadership is occurring at all levels.
We are very mindful that Rhode Island is part of a movement occurring at a local, state, and federal level, and each level has different contexts and constraints associated with the ability to change policies and practices that we think that if they were in sync could potentially magnify each other's effects. And so an example of this in Rhode Island is that while we have Rhode Island providers who are engaging in this very important work, they are looking to the state to more effectively create a funding structure that can support them. And while Rhode Island and other states are incentivizing and encouraging real jobs at real wages, the 14C certificates still exist, and we look to federal leadership to present a real plan to phase 14C certificates out over time. However, a shared vision keeps us united, and a commitment to making that shared vision a reality allows us to operate from a place of respect and to learn and encourage each other and challenge each other to do better. Governor Chafee in the state of Rhode Island often reference a specific quote said by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He stated, "It is one thing to agree that the goal of integration is morally and legally right. It is another thing to commit oneself positively and actively to the idea of integration. This is no day to pay lip service to integration. We must pay life service to it." Life service instead of lip service truly embodies how Rhode Island is approaching our work, creating a state where Olmstead is fully operational. And in keeping with our kind of pragmatic Pollyanna approach, Michelle and I would like to conclude with two additional quotes from Dr. King that we both seek inspiration from, but also that highlight the balance of our work moving forward.
So first, Dr. King stated, we have an ultimate goal of freedom, independence, self-determination, but we aren't going to get all of that now, and we aren't going to get all of that next year. While some in our communities may wish that the segregated day services and sheltered workshop be eliminated overnight, in Rhode Island we have decided that it is not what's best for all members of our community, and it's not good policy. So we would close, if we could close the doors tomorrow, we would, but we have examples in other arenas. For example, in the housing and homeless world, which is, where I spent 20 years of my life working. And we know in that arena that Rhode Island is moving from a state of sheltering the homeless to a state of housing the homeless, but we have to actually fund two systems at once. We can't close all the shelters and leave individuals with no options. As we build the capacity of our system and create enough permanent supportive housing for individuals to live in, we still have to keep people housed in shelters. So we kind of are looking at the systems change we learned in the housing world and adopting that in our employment first world. And as we build the capacity of our system and bring parents, individuals, business leaders, communities to the table, we really feel this is a good way to move forward. So instead, we're mindful that justice too long delayed is justice denied, and therefore providers, advocates, consumers, families, businesses, and public servants must continue to work collaboratively and deliberatively over the weeks, months, and years ahead.
And second, Dr. King stated, we must accept finite disappointment, but we must never lose infinite hope. Michelle and I are lifelong members of the Rhode Island community, and we both firmly believe in the motto of our state, which is hope. On a personal level, as a sibling, hope has gotten my family through many lengthy hospitalizations, sleepless nights filled with seizures, and the uncertainty and fear that comes as my siblings enter transition age. Likewise, hope allows our colleagues and I to continue to collaborate with each other and our stakeholders even when we don't see eye to eye. Hope allows us to see past today's headlines in pursuit of tomorrow's success stories, like the story of Stephen that Eve shared with us today. Hope reconciles that at times this daunting, hard work ahead of us also is exciting, and that there are fulfilling outcomes that we are witnessing and we will continue to witness both in Rhode Island and across the country as we heed this new kind of clarion call and collectively make the ideals of Olmstead a reality. Thank you all so much for this opportunity. We both greatly appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Michelle and Andrew. We really appreciate your comments, and we appreciate the hard work that is going into Rhode Island's ongoing transition to integrated employment. Our next speaker is yet another distinguished national expert, Jennifer Mathis, who I've had the honor and the privilege of working with on any number of critical disability policy issues. Deputy Legal Director and Director of Programs for the Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law. For those of you who work in Washington and many of you who work outside of it, Jennifer is a name that requires no introduction, but she has a long and illustrious history of working on the Medicaid rights of adults and children, discrimination claims under the Americans with Disabilities Act, issues related to judicial nominations, and a wide variety of other critical civil, human, and disability rights, legislation, regulation, and policy issues. Jennifer, take it away.
Thank you. So I'm delighted to be on this webinar with so many folks who have played such an important role in these issues. This issue of Olmstead's application to employment settings has been a real focus for us in recent years at the Bazelon Center. We've been very heavily involved for decades in community integration work, including in the Olmstead case itself and long before the Olmstead case. And one of the things that has been a little bit frustrating to watch is seeing the fruits of many people's labors and the successes of moving lots of folks, or giving folks the opportunity to move into integrated living settings, into their own homes, out of institutions, in many cases after decades of institutional living, and having people have a chance at a life and seeing them spend their days in segregated day programs and to have an integrated bed at night, essentially. And so, as Eve said, you shouldn't be essentially in an integrated living setting, but have to spend your day all day in a segregated setting, which is, the day is where we spend much of our waking hours. So, this has been a very important issue, and glad that it's sort of on the top of most people's radar screens now. So I was asked to talk about the implications for people with psychiatric disabilities. And I have to say, in the mental health world, many of us have been following very closely the Rhode Island investigation and settlement agreement, and we'll be monitoring the progress of implementing the settlement agreement, because this has tremendous implications for people with all types of disabilities, including people with psychiatric disabilities. And we have a problem in the mental health world. We have really low employment numbers. We've got about 20% of people with serious mental illnesses employed. This is compared to rates that are generally about 63, 64, 65% for people without disabilities. So that's, you know, a third of the employment rate of people without disabilities. And of that 20%, we're talking actually a total of 12% that are actually employed full-time. And the vast majority of people with serious mental illnesses, people in public mental health systems, spend their days in day treatment programs, which tend to be, not always, but tend to be segregated, facility-based day programs where people spend the day with other people with mental illnesses in a room, you know, sometimes going into the community, but much of the activity takes place in a room where people are interacting only with other people with disabilities. Employment is often very little of the focus of such programs, sometimes not a focus at all. Yet we have services that work to promote employment for people with psychiatric disabilities, and services that we've had for quite some time. The services that have been extremely successful in getting people into jobs and that have success rates that are, you know, far greater than the rates of getting people into jobs that happen from, say, day programs and other traditional mental health services. They also have success in promoting better health outcomes as well. It turns out that when people work, actually people experience many life changes that you know, impact on a variety of things, including their health and quality of life. Ironically, we have several decades of research studies showing how successful supported employment services are for people with psychiatric disabilities, which is interesting because these are not services that are widely available even today. And you would think that perhaps we're talking about new services, experimental services, and yet we're talking about services that really there's a pretty long and extensive evidence base for. I thought it was interesting. We're clearing out some old boxes that we've had in storage at the Bazelon Center for many years, and we pulled out a box yesterday, and there was a letter from 1996 from a service provider in the District of Columbia talking to us about a supported employment program that they were working on and saying essentially, you know, this is really great stuff. This is called IPS, Individual Placement and Services, which is mainly what we're talking about today. It's a gold standard for supported employment for people with psychiatric disabilities. And they're saying people want to work overwhelmingly. Consumers consistently report clear preferences for competitive work opportunities with flexible on and off site job supports, but very few such opportunities exist. Instead, the system relies heavily on a traditional stepwise approach to rehabilitation. So this is 18 years ago. So this is not new stuff. But here we are. So I said people with psychiatric disabilities want to work. Most of the studies that have been done, surveys, show something like at least 2/3 of people in the public mental health systems would like to work. And I think that's an undercount because it doesn't really account for the discouragement that has happened over many, many years. People have been told, you'll never work, you know, that's not for you. You belong in this kind of setting, and, you know, this is how you should spend your day, or work is too stressful for you, or you could never do it. So that's, you know, 2/3 of people say they want to work, even with that backdrop. So I think it would probably be significantly higher if you could get over some of those assumptions that have been drilled into people that work is not for them. And as other folks have said, employment is a critical part of recovery. Work brings social integration, social acceptance, gives people a sense of purpose and value, and one of the hardest things often about mental health recovery is giving a person the tools to feel confident about his or her own value and abilities, since many folks have been told for many, many years that they don't have a reason to be optimistic about that. So really the work has brought tremendous transformation in how people see themselves as well as live their lives. I have, again here, a reference to IPS. As I said, this is individual placement and support. This is sort of when we talk about supported employment for people with psychiatric disabilities, primarily today we're talking about IPS because IPS is, I think, the most studied and the thing that most works and has the best results. So I just wanted to lay out some of the key elements of supported employment for people with psychiatric disabilities. These are things that involve identifying people's skills and interests and career goals, helping people do an individualized job search that is tailored around those skills and those interests, providing people with on-the-job supports like interpersonal skills training and counseling, identifying needed accommodations that the person may need to stay on the job, job development, which really means working with employers to develop relationships and understand what their business needs are so that you can effectively match employers with job seekers with disabilities, job carving, identifying ways that a job can be restructured or duties can be carved out in order to facilitate employment of people with disabilities while still meeting the employer's needs. Benefits counseling, of course, a critical part of all supported employment services, where you help people understand what the impact of working is actually going to be on their benefits and understand what programs exist that allow people to work while still maintaining some of their benefits. Some of the important elements of individual placement and support, I think, that are particularly relevant to Olmstead are that, number one, it has a no-reject policy. Everybody qualifies for services. So when you're talking about who is qualified under the ADA, everybody is qualified for supported employment services for people with mental illnesses, at least under an IPS model, which is really the model that most people are using or moving toward at this point. And this is really premised on the idea that the principle is that everybody is an appropriate candidate for competitive integrated employment, and people with mental illnesses are capable of working. And eligibility is supposed to happen regardless of diagnosis or symptoms or work history and other issues. And as I said, it's competitive integrated employment. That is the goal. That is the focus of supported employment, IPS. Rapid job placement. Somebody made a reference to, I think, place train, that essentially you're talking about not having people go through years and years and years of training programs as used to happen to get them ready to go to work, but rather to help people get into jobs right away and then work with them to help develop skills to maintain employment. And of course, all of this is driven by individual preferences. That's important for many reasons, not only because that's a good way to do business and people are happy when they actually get listened to and have their choices respected, but also people tend to stay on the job longer and to do a better job when it's a job that they want. So these services can be financed through Medicaid. I think that there have been over the years some misconceptions about what is and isn't coverable through Medicaid. It is a little bit complicated, but these range of services that are in supported employment for people with psychiatric disabilities can be covered through various Medicaid options. Some of them, not all of them, can be covered through the regular state plan Medicaid rehab option. In fact, many of them can be. The job development is the big one that can't. CMS now has been, I think, fairly clear that all of the supported employment services that you would need for people with a serious mental illness can be covered under the 1915I option. This is basically a state plan Medicaid option for home and community-based services. These services can also be covered under these 1115 demonstration waivers that many states are submitting now under, that happened through the Affordable Care Act or as a result of the Affordable Care Act, and then through managed care waivers. There are other ways that Medicaid can be used to cover some of these services as well, but these are really some of the key ones for people with psychiatric disabilities. The main point is that Medicaid does cover these services, despite people's, I think, misconceptions that it doesn't. Day treatment yet remains the default that is available to most people in public mental health systems. I think it is now less than 2% of the clients of public mental health systems that get supported employment services. That's incredibly low, and it's, I think, maybe 20%, less than 20% who are working. So lots of people would be qualified for supported employment services, could benefit from supported employment services, but less than 2% are getting them. And instead, the sort of default majority service is day treatment. Day treatment, as I said, tends to be facility-based. It's basically rehabilitation services, getting people social skills, to some extent employment skills, recreational activities. People spend most of the day with other people with disabilities, and often the services are not what you would call in vivo. That when you learn skills, you're often sitting in a room. Actually, a lot of the time in many programs is spent doing things like playing games, bingo, puzzles, talking about current events, and not actually really skill building. But to the extent that there are skill building activities, often many of them are really kind of explaining things. If you were to do this, then this is how you would do it. Very different than actually going to a job site and actually learning on the job. And we know that people with psychiatric disabilities, significant psychiatric disabilities, tend to learn best, as we say, in vivo, or in the settings where they're actually going to use the skills that you're talking about, exactly what supported employment does for people. Supported employment is also less costly than day treatment services. Typically, supported employment, there's a range of costs depending on the person. On average, I think the figures that I have seen have ranged from $3,500 to $5,000 a year per person. Often I see $4,000 a year. That is in contrast to something like $14,000 a year. Again, day treatment ranges depending on the program, depending on the person, but typically states will spend a lot more money through the Medicaid program on day treatment services than they will on supported employment services to serve the same folks. Supported employment not only is cheaper in that respect, but it also helps states realize other cost savings because it reduces other services like hospitalizations. And so there was a big study a couple of years ago, the mental health treatment study that was funded by the Social Security Administration, finding that even just looking at the hospital costs alone, that supported employment reduced hospital use by about $1,800 a year per person, which is pretty significant when you're talking about a lot of people. Putting this all together, applying Olmstead to the context of people with psychiatric disabilities in employment settings, people with psychiatric disabilities overwhelmingly want to work. People with psychiatric disabilities are qualified for supported employment services. Those services are premised on the idea that everybody is qualified for them. Supported employment services occur in integrated employment settings, in real job settings, in contrast to day treatment programs that occur in segregated facility-based settings. supported employment is less costly. And I think the upshot of all this, if someone were to do a legal analysis of Olmstead's application, is therefore that the clear message for states is you've got a lot of Medicaid dollars that you are spending on day treatment services that you ought to reallocate to supported employment services. And I don't have a closing quote from Martin Luther King, but or any words of inspiration, but I think the point should be inspirational enough. Thank you.
Well, it's certainly inspirational enough to me. Thank you so much, Jennifer. We are going to save our questions for the very end because our last speaker, like our other speakers, is incredibly knowledgeable, and we want to make sure that she has an opportunity to adequately explain the critical issues upon which she is working. Lisa Mills is an independent consultant for Moving to a Different Drum, a subject matter expert for ODEP's Employment First State Leadership Mentoring Program, the National Lead Center, and the Olmstead Employment Resources and Rebalancing Initiative. Dr. Mills has worked with a wide variety of states and organizations on issues relating to Medicaid finance supported employment services, managed care, and a wide variety of other issues connected to integrated employment outcomes for people with developmental disabilities. Lisa, please.
Thank you, Ari. I appreciate the opportunity to address people today. I'll try to move quickly through my slides so there's time for questions. It's amazing that we're celebrating the 15th year of Olmstead. But if I even go back 5 years to 2009, if someone back then would have told me we'd be having this discussion today, just 5 years later, I probably would have told them they were drinking some bad Kool-Aid. It is really incredible and remarkable how much momentum for change has developed around full access to integrated employment in this country. And I really want to commend the federal government, the Department of Justice, and all of its partners for the work they have done to help lead the country forward. I'm going to talk a bit about the challenges that states are facing. And you heard some about that from Rhode Island. And really what we're seeing is that this is not an easy systems change, but clearly Rhode Island sets a strong example for what good effort looks like and what a commitment to making real change looks like. I'm going to try to move my slides. Nakia, if you could help me move my slide, I don't seem to have control. Thank you. So one of the major things that states are facing is just the sheer numbers of people they have in segregated settings due to the over-reliance on these models that have developed over the years. And so this is a daunting task, but not one that we can't achieve. But unfortunately, we have limited federal policy options that sometimes make it difficult for states to figure out how to do this in a careful way to ensure that people actually experience better outcomes as a result of transitioning out of segregated settings. And we do want people, obviously, to move into integrated employment with meaningful wages and hours. So federal partners are working very hard with states to come up with creative ways to do things, which is really has been very helpful. But we work in a framework of rules that isn't always aligned with employment first. Next slide, please. The other thing that we've learned is that it's very, very important for state administrations to bring along state legislatures. And that's not always an easy task, but it's one that has to be done very early on in the process. There needs to be alignment and mutual understanding of why change needs to happen so that there is broad-based support in state government for change. some of the other challenges are that there are certain programs in states that actually appear to reinforce segregation, and state use programs being one of those examples. And so there is a need to address the conflict in goals and in how programs are carried out when we're trying to make a shift to integrated employment. And as a side note, ODEP has been working on a set of recommendations for state use programs around Olmstead compliance that will be released in the very near future, because I do get a lot of questions about so what do we do differently in order for state use to actually be an agent of positive change. The last thing that not all states face, but many do, is local control. And of course, local control is often very highly valued in the states, but that can result in very inconsistent buy-in across the state for change and different challenges about how to make things happen. Next slide. Also, most every state is facing lack of capacity and expertise within the agencies to manage the scope of the change required. And you heard from Rhode Island about how broad the scope of change needs to be. And many state governments have downsized and have fewer and fewer staff. And expertise is always not there because integrated employment services were never a large part of disability services in general. And there is really sometimes an absence of expertise. And then one of the other things I think we need to come to terms with as we move things forward is that we just haven't been placing a lot of folks in jobs on an annual basis. The data is pretty stark. And when we think about systems change and we think about the numbers of people who have not had access to integrated employment and who are currently in segregated settings, we need to significantly increase our ability to place people in jobs and, more importantly, to keep them in those jobs. Some of the data around people retaining employment is concerning, and that needs to be as much a focus as securing people jobs. Next slide. Probably you've heard this before, but I can't talk about it enough, how much low expectations pervades our systems and how much we approach when we approach change with low expectations, how little progress we can actually make. We see a lot of doubt about the future cloud commitment to change and really prevent the kind of resolute actions that are necessary to make change happen. The kind of things that Rhode Island is doing is going forward with a total intent to succeed. And we need every state to approach the challenge in that way. There's an old quote from Henry Ford that I really like: those who think they can do something and those who can't are both, those who think they can't are both right. And in fact, doubt and low expectations, if that is present in state leadership, can have a very negative effect on the ability of a state to execute change. And unfortunately, what's happening is we're seeing some states make a lot of compromises before, as I say, the horse is even out of the gate, not setting the bar high. We need to set the bar high. And of course, again, we look to Rhode Island as an example in terms of defining employment as an individual job in a regular business, paid at regular wages, and with the average expectation of people working weekly to be 20 hours. And I think if we don't set bars high, we will not succeed in the way that we need to. So we need to get beyond doubt and low expectations so that outcome targets can be set that actually will help us realize the goal. Next slide. One of the issues we've come up with in the states we've worked on with is just the question of how do you make this a priority? And as state Medicaid agencies and disability agencies are facing many, many challenges and lots of change, it seems that one of the main issues is how do we get this to rise to the top in a way that will ensure the state puts enough resources and time in to actually move the needle on this. And the question really comes, will the over-reliance on segregated employment and day services ever be a crisis in a state? Now, certainly if the U.S. Department of Justice comes knocking at your door, this may change where this goal lands on your priority list. But we have to figure out a way that this becomes a priority without having to have legal action occur. Next slide. So I think in a way, as I look back over just what's happened in the last 3 to 5 years, that we are reaching a tipping point. And as I listen to today, I see the momentum around the country in terms of states recognizing that this is not something that can be ignored any longer. So we know that change is a large undertaking. You certainly can see elements of good systems change efforts in every state, but you don't necessarily see enough of an emphasis on change to make things happen. So we've got to stop, in my words, nibbling around the edges if we really intend to create systems change. Employment First is really like a new religion. You must be so determined, and I think about Linda Rolfe in the state of Washington, but you must be so determined and clear about your values and the importance of this that you hold on to it despite a lot of other challenges that will be thrown in the way. Next slide. So we do see many states now using leadership from the top. The number of governors, thanks to Governor Markell in Delaware, but the number of governors that are taking this issue, speaking eloquently about it, legislation that is passing, governors passing executive orders, and I would encourage you to read the new executive order from the state of Illinois if you haven't read it. And the use of task forces appointed by governors is raising the bar on this issue and showing that this is, in fact, becoming a major priority in government far beyond just disability agencies. Next slide. Something that seems to be working really well is tying these goals around employment to other policy goals that the state is heavily invested in, like workforce development, economic recovery, entitlement reform, and to the new CMS regulations and the need for states to come into compliance with those provide yet another opportunity for states to focus on integrated employment. We see a number of states targeting new investments to integrated employment. For example, rapid expansion of Project Search, doing strategic things with waiting lists by offering people on waiting lists services and supports to obtain employment. We've seen some states fully fund their vocational rehabilitation agency so that it can pull down full federal match. And we see special initiatives for youth coming out of schools to make sure that the supports are there for them to go to work. So there are a lot of ways we're seeing states invest money but be very targeted in focusing it on employment. We're also seeing an effort to leave no one out. The growth in states' interest in the 1915I option under the Medicaid state plan, to use that around employment to reach people who have not been eligible for employment supports has been really important. And we do see states looking to rebalance investments to ensure that systems change can be supported over the long term. Next slide. What we know now through experiences, this effort needs to be much bigger than one or two agencies. This isn't just about the Medicaid agency who may be paying for segregated settings. It's not just about the voc rehab agency. This is an effort that has to cut across all of state government. And what I like about the Illinois executive order is the expectation that the state government will come together to create a very strong strategic plan with timelines, commitments, and good accountability. And really helping states realize the comprehensive nature of what needs to happen and change. Next slide. To help states with that, ODEP and EconSys, its partner, has been working on a state self-assessment tool related to ensuring that states are serving people in the most integrated employment and day service settings. That tool will be released in the very near future. It takes a real comprehensive look across state government in terms of all of the things that may be contributing to over-reliance on segregated settings and all of the strategies and policies that could contribute to shifting that towards a focus on integrated employment as the first option. So it looks at Olmstead plans, statutes, rules, executive orders, litigation. It looks at 6 different state agencies and the programs within them. It cuts across 5 different disability subgroups, and it looks at employers, the role of employers, and what the state is doing around incentives and supports. So we're very excited to release this tool, and I wanted to put a plug in for it today. I think that's the end of my presentation, so I'll turn it back to Ari.
Lisa, thank you so much. We appreciate a comprehensive review of many of the major technical issues emerging in implementation of Employment First. We have time for a few small questions. We'll be running another 10 minutes until 4:35. I'd like to start with a question focused primarily to Eve, but any of the other presenters should feel free to respond to it as well. It actually comes from our audience. As you mentioned, a significant number of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are being hired at Walgreens, Procter & Gamble, and other companies that are engaged in dedicated outreach efforts to hire people with disabilities. And this is generally something that we view as a positive trend. But I know that many have expressed concern that some of the employment models that are being promoted still involve a disproportionate amount of people with disabilities congregated into specific parts of those companies' workforces, like warehouses or other work settings that may be a part of their supply chain, but are structured in such a way as to disproportionately recruit people with disabilities to that specific part of that supply chain. And so the question is there a risk that at some point those models might themselves no longer truly constitute an integrated setting?
Sure. There's a risk that we could end up seeing companies who hire all people with disabilities, all people with one particular kind of disability, all to do one kind of job. I think in the examples that you mentioned, that's not exactly what's happening, in that they started out hiring, so Walgreens, for example, started out hiring people with a variety of disabilities into its distribution centers and has now rolled out the program to its retail and other kinds of jobs as well. So they recognized, oh, yeah, we can do this everywhere. So I think employers are starting in one way and learning that the rollout can be in every area of their employment. But we need to, integration and segregation are on a spectrum. So things are more segregated, and sheltered workshops are primarily very segregated in that only people with disabilities work there and their supervisors. And individual jobs in small businesses are very integrated. So there's only one person with a disability working there. They're the only one doing this kind of job and so forth. And there's a wide range in between, everything from group, which is more segregated, to enclaves and employers who hire quite a few people with disabilities and so forth. So there's no black and white line where something becomes, oh, this is now completely segregated. So we're playing around the whole spectrum. And our perspective is that the whole spectrum is legitimate. We don't say one thing is illegal. But the focus needs to be on having people with disabilities have access to all the different kinds of jobs so that they can be matched with the job that will work for this person, so that they have selections of all kinds of jobs, and so that they can work with people with disabilities in all those jobs. So we have to be worried about that, but I don't know that it's our number one worry at the moment. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thanks so much, Eve. Do any of the other speakers want to speak to that issue? Hearing none, we'll move on to the next question. Much discussion has gone into the values framework for promoting integrated supported employment. But I'd like to ask you, and really any of you should feel free to respond to this, with respect to rate setting and the structure of Medicaid payments to providers, what should states be focusing on in order to incentivize individual integrated employment as an outcome for people with disabilities, and to incentivize systems change on the part of existing providers that may be operating workshops or enclave or group-supported employment to review and change their business model? Lisa, I'm wondering if perhaps you could start on this one.
I would say with regard to incentivizing outcomes that we need to look at reimbursement models that actually align with how supported employment and similar employment services are delivered. And typical fee-for-service models used in Medicaid or flat outcome-based models that may be used in voc rehab really don't do the job. We need to look at outcome-based models that take account of people's level of disability and the length of time they have been employed. And we need to reward production of the outcome rather than necessarily paying for service delivery. Now, that's oversimplified. I think in regard to supporting provider change, that needs to be, and I like what Rhode Island had to say about maintaining two systems. We did that with institutional closures, and it worked. You talk about bridge funding and other methods for enabling us to actually help people in a very individualized way to secure integrated employment to make the transition out. So I think that we need ways to provide that kind of support and technical assistance to organizations.
Excellent.
This is Jennifer. I just add one quick thing. I think with the sort of outcome-based models, I think it is a very important tool. At the same time, I think you have to be careful about incentivizing providers to pick people who they think are going to be the easiest folks to work with and the folks who have the least service needs. And so, this is not mutually exclusive. I think you can have outcome-based incentives, and at the same time, just build into what a state is purchasing that, you need to serve folks with all range of needs. You need to serve folks with very significant needs too. And it's not that hard if you try to figure it out for states to control what they are paying for.
This is Andrew. One of the things that Rhode Island is embarking on is phasing funding to greater incentivize supported employment services and integrated day services. And truly moving the money with the intention of moving people. However, parallel to that, a state could have the highest job development rate in the country, but without, clear competencies and the appropriate opportunities for providers to train staff and to then correspondingly bill for those for that staff's time, having the highest rates in the world won't necessarily get you to the outcome that you're looking at or you're looking for. And so we really aren't taking an either-or approach, but truly trying to move both forward, and are seeing some success in doing that and providing providers the technical assistance that they need, and at the same time moving the money to the places that we want the community to move as well.
Andrew, one follow-up question, and this will be our final question before we unfortunately have to close. You mentioned integrated day services, and that's something that's been talked about often in the same phrasing, in the same breath as integrated employment, certainly because the settlement agreement sets a goal of, sets a requirement of an average of 20 hours a week for people with work for people with developmental disabilities in Rhode Island. It's expected that some form of integrated day services would be required. Can you briefly speak to the nature of integrated day service provision as opposed to segregated day services and how your state is aiming to facilitate a transition from one to the other?
Yes. I'll kind of go definitionally first. The consent decree actually does provide a very clear definition and expectations around what integrated day services looks like. But quite frankly, much like we call a job supported employment services, likewise, when we're talking about integrated day services, what we're really talking about is supporting a person's life, what supports they need in order to engage in their community the way that many of us have the opportunity to. And so that means engaging with persons of their choosing at the times that they would like to choose. So what that doesn't look like is individuals going to a segregated day facility between 9 and 3. It means having access to their communities, so the appropriate infrastructure to be able to support that. And it really begins to delineate between community-based services and integrated day services, and that's actually where Rhode Island is really what we're working on as we speak, which is this idea that we can bring individuals who were previously segregated into a more integrated environment, and often, unfortunately, what that looks like is 15 people in a van going to the mall. That would not meet the threshold that we have required of ourselves for integrated day services. It really looks at a process that is person-centered and that ensures that the individual has the power, including if that person has limited verbal abilities, to select and to choose what they do with their day. I think the second part of the question is, how is Rhode Island doing that? Part of it is, again,
we may not have much time to get to that point, unfortunately. So if you can summarize.
Yes. Well, it's a short answer. we're working on it, and we welcome other states and other counties' suggestions and recommendations as we move forward on this issue.
I would just briefly say, too, we're working with the businesses. Next Tuesday, the director of BHDDH is bringing together the different agencies to talk about potential changes to rates, regulations, and it really is trying to work with agencies and organizations to develop a new business model. So this is not easy, and we're looking for all the help we can get from everyone out there.
Well, thank you to all of our illustrious and knowledgeable speakers. We appreciate you being so generous with your time and with your expertise. I'd also like to thank Assistant Secretary Martinez, the Office of Disability Employment Policy, and the National Lead Center for hosting this webinar, and encourage all those listening who are not already registered with the EFSLMP Community of Practice to do so. Thank you all very much for joining us today, and thank you for the work that you do and the work that we know you will continue to do out in the States. Please, have a good afternoon.